Welcome back to the YWAM Nashville Podcast. This is Nolan from the media team. Youth of the Mission Nashville is a missional community that's been reaching the Nashville area for over 30 years. Our heart is to see the name of Jesus made known to the nations by training and equipping missionaries to go from Nashville to the ends of the earth. This series is designed to give you a taste of what DBS lectures are like here at YWAM Nashville. This week's episode features Michael Young, a YWAM Bible teacher and the campus director of YWAM Detroit. He takes us through the Intertestamental Period, the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, asking the important question, was God really silent during that time? Let's dive in.
Let's get into this, because you guys have already been trucking through the early and some scholars call them the major prophets, which major just means they wrote a lot. It doesn't mean like major and minor is not importance. It's just these are the big books, and then these other ones are usually the small books. That's usually what it means. So when they mean major prophets, it's usually Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Daniel, and then which Daniel, I don't know how I got that category other than whatever, because it's not like his is bigger than like Hosea or some of the other ones. But it is what it is. And then you have all the minor prophets. And now we're really tagging in this week on the end of where you guys have already been. So we're looking at like, all right, the people are in exile. So we're going to do a little recap. This is not hopefully new information for you, just kind of recapping where you've been, right? So Israel, the northern kingdom, been gone for a while now, right? Assyria came in and took care of them in 722. And then Judah lasts for a little while longer, because if you trace the kings, especially in the first and second Kings, where it says like, all right, this person did evil in the sight of the Lord versus this did good. In the northern kingdom, you don't have a single king that's ever mentioned to do good in the eyes of the Lord once they split. The southern kingdom, though, has several. And so some of that points to, okay, they last a little bit longer because they had some blips of positive influence in their history. But eventually it still, derails. And Jeremiah and those really chronicle what that looks like. Because the good part is, when you guys are early in the Bible, you got historical narrative. And historical narrative tells you everything you need to know in an ancient Near Eastern way. Right? So it's never like you're reading it and then they go in parentheses and be like, oh, this person did this thing. And in parentheses, by the way, you're supposed to understand that this was a bad decision. You're just supposed to pick up whether this is good or bad, according to the narrative. The good part about the prophets is that they will not only tell you this is what's wrong, but they also say this is how God feels about it. This is what he's going to do about it. So you get the entire picture when you hit the prophets, where earlier before you're supposed to pick up those things, right? So even like in Genesis, you got things like when after Cain and Abel, you have the split of genealogies. You start going through, especially Cain's line, which it's supposed to depict for you like this is how things are getting worse and worse. And it's the first time one of his descendants is mentioned to take 2 wives. That's the first time it's ever mentioned. Now, before that, you already had the Genesis story where God created man and woman and set up this is what humanity is supposed to look like. So the way historical narrative works is when you hit a space where it's in an evil line, which is Cain, and they go and they took 2 wives. You're immediately supposed to catalog that and go, they are deviating from what God set up prior. Right. Again, they don't go out of their way to tell you that. They're just expecting you as an educated reader to pick that up. Huh. So when people do arguments like, oh, well, God was okay with all this. No, he set up something. And every time you see a different plan of that, it is not according to that. He's still dealing with broken and evil people and working around it. Now, you get to these guys, and they just spell it all out for you. Right? So we're going to map through, obviously, like Ezra and Nehemiah, which is more on the historical side of things, with some of the prophets that are contemporary in there. Because now we're going to have to do that. Same thing as you guys did with the Kings, right? You got 1st and Kings, but then you got Isaiah fits within that timeline. So does Jeremiah. And Ezekiel overlaps with that. So we're going to do the same, because you need to see the history and the prophets at the same time. Yeah, and this is a little bit of the timeline, the 3 waves of exile returning to the land. This is the 3 waves leaving, right? So when Judah went down, first wave, which is where Daniel left around 605. And then not too long after, you have where Ezekiel's wave, the second wave, went in 597. And in 586 is where Nebuchadnezzar is like, I'm done. I'm tired of trekking my troops all the way over here for this minor, insignificant little country. We're not dealing with it anymore. So they just level everything. And they basically take anybody else that's useful, which means that's why there were still people left with Jeremiah. They're like, they had 3 picks. They didn't make it. So whoever was left with Jeremiah, which Jeremiah chose to stay, but everybody else who's left, it's like those kids in elementary school, unfortunately. It's like they picked everybody they want on the team. These didn't make the cut. So like if so they're taking anybody that could be useful to the kingdom of Babylon. And so that's just who gets left out. And obviously Jerusalem and the temple all destroyed at this point. So think of it from the Israelites' perspective, or from Judah specifically, because this is where we start getting the term the Jews, right? So prior to this, you have Israel, and Israel has 12-ish tribes. It's never quite exactly 12. There's always either more or less mentioned in different things. So there's 12 tribes plus Levi and all the things. But the people who are descendants of the tribe of Judah are the ones eventually we start calling Jews, which means everybody prior to this, everybody else was Israelite. Not every Israelite was a Jew, because that depended on if you were just from that tribe or not. But after this, because Judah is the primary tribe that's left, this just becomes a term for, most of these people are from Judah, and now they just start calling, even if there's a Benjamite or anybody sprinkled in, there's like, everybody's just Jews. Okay, so this is where the term originates.
Jehoiakim, was he exiled? Or Jehoiakim exiled in verse?
To be honest, off the top of my head, I don't remember. I have it in my major prophets teaching. But yeah, what was the order? Because it was...
I always get those mixed up.
Yeah, because there's Jehoiachin, then Jehoiakim, then last is Zedekiah, who is the worst one of all of them. Yeah, there's one of whoever was it Jehoiachin? Someone can help me out here.
Jehoiakim was exiled first.
Yeah, but there's the one I can't remember talking about who's mentioned that's still alive.
Jehoiachin.
Yeah, so
he's the one that gets invited to the king's table.
Yeah, because they're giving you that because they want you to know, like, hey, remember God made this promise that the line of David would be sustained. So they're throwing that in there to go, hey, by the way, everybody else is gone, but there is still a guy, even though he's not the greatest. There's still somebody that the line will continue. And as you hit Ezra and Nehemiah, you see where this line has continued, and you get Zerubbabel, who is of that same line, who comes back. And so it's just keeping the thread of the promise to David, and his throne will go on, that there's still somebody that exists from this family line.
Yeah.
There's the other important points to remember, especially as Ezra and Nehemiah kick in, like God's presence from the temple left. Like in Ezekiel, he spells it out. Because the people at that time were like, look, we think we're okay. God's okay with us. Because number one, he would never let another foreign nation come in and destroy his temple. It just won't happen. Right? Because of an ancient Near Eastern concept where they're like, if one country conquers another, that equals their God is stronger than this God. Mm-hmm. And so in their mindset, God would never allow that to happen. But Ezekiel, he's like, no, he'll absolutely let it happen. And first, he's going to pick up and move. He's going to leave the building because without his presence, that's all it is. It's just a building. It has zero importance if God's presence isn't there. So Ezekiel goes in and tells them he left. Like, you guys can't bank on this being your good luck charm of being as evil as you are, and God won't do anything about it. He's making it known. And two, they no longer have a king. Right? Because by the time Jeremiah is done with his prophetic ministry, they're down to Gedaliah, which is a governor, which they then murder and deal away with anyways. So there's no king at this point in time, which is all very important because here's all the promises from Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel of what God's saying he will promise to do through and beyond the exile. So you'll find these all sprinkled in, that the promises God makes is that, hey, I will bring you back to this land, right? That's one of the promises spelled out, that he will return, like his presence will come back to them. There'll be a reestablishing, like the line of David will continue. The priesthood will be reestablished, as you find this near the end of Ezekiel. He'll give the people a new heart and a new spirit, and there'll be a new covenant, right? All that's spelled out. But the way the Bible works is you then start reading the stories of as people return, and you're looking for when do these things actually happen. Because they say these are promises, but not all these things happen in the time period of just when people show back up in the land.
Right.
Okay, so many scholars would tell you that exile, technically, even if people return to the land, exile doesn't end until all of these are completed. Even if it takes much longer. So for some, like they would say the exile goes until the Gospels kick off. Because not all these things happen in these next books. So we'll spell that out as we go along. All right, little quick map. Here's the little snapshot of like the peak of the Babylonian Empire and how much land that encompassed.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, and this is pretty typical. Obviously, you see Israel and their land is just right here. I don't know why they really include this. No one lives here. All right, this is just a desert right here. So it's a, ancient life can only happen around the rivers. No one would travel from Babylon to here because they would all die on the journey. No one had technology to travel this desert at that current time. But you see most of Turkey, all of Iraq, and this would border over here to where the Persians would be, which is modern day Iran. Now they had taken over what was there at the time, but then it's not that they don't last super long, right? Nebuchadnezzar gets that warning from Daniel, like, hey, this like statue thing, and you guys are just the head. There's more people coming. Now Nebuchadnezzar is arrogant enough to respond to that by making just a whole statue of gold, which was just the color of the head in the vision. Like, no, we're here forever. And then he doesn't. And then, later on, these guys take over and make this empire. So this is the Persians. You can see now we have to zoom out to capture theirs because this was the Babylonian Empire. It ended around here and went to this area. This is the Persians. As they take over Babylon and destroy them, they just keep going. So eventually they're known to rule from India to Ethiopia in scope. So, and this is kind of the way this time period goes. Every time a new empire comes up and demolishes the previous one, they end up getting bigger. Until eventually you end up in the first century of the Roman Empire, which is by far dwarfs this. It's vastly bigger. So we're just in this process of like every time somebody gets conquered, the next one is worse and larger over time. But the Persians are the main ones for this week leading up to the Intertestamental Period. So that blank page that Karim was mentioning, that's a good, when the prophets stop speaking, which is Malachi is the last one that's mentioned in the Old Testament, there's a good 400-ish year gap between there and the Gospels. So it's not that God just was like, I'm just going to sit this one out. I'll show back up in a few hundred years, then we'll fix it. It just meant that many times the scholars will call this like the 400 years of silence.
Right.
What they mean by that is there's not a prophetic voice that's there anymore. But it does not mean God's not working and doing things. So that's what we're going to, when we get to the end of this week, we look just at intertestamental. What we mean is, what is the things that God is doing in that 400-year period leading up to the arrival of Jesus? So it helps you kind of bridge from the Old Testament prophecies to like, hey, there's a lot of change that happens in that 400-year period. How do we get from this stuff to all of a sudden you open the New Testament and we're talking about the Roman Empire. We're talking about, people like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes and the Zealots, and all that just pops up. And in those 400 years, all those things develop. And so that's what we'll take a pretty long snapshot into that.
Awesome.
All right. So what was just going back to I guess this would be your last week when you talk about Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah. Is there anything in there that you can remember of like, this is super important, or was there questions that you had still left from that week? Because I can see if they tie into this week. So, if you take Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah and put them together, that's about equal to the New Testament as far as content. So it's a lot of stuff to cover.
So just a quick question on those three.
Or that, yeah, anything in the last week, because obviously those overlap with the Kings. And I want to move past that and just be like, here's a whole new set of stuff. If there's stuff that you're like, oh, this would be helpful to hash out. But you don't have to.
Well, a question about Esther, but I think we covered that this week.
Yeah, that will come up this week. Yeah, we'll get to Esther. So that's the other thing is we'll kind of dance around. We're going to play them as if they show up. All right, so as they show up. So today we'll talk more about Ezra, and then that also play into some of the minor prophets that play into that before we hit Esther, and then eventually on to Nehemiah and then Malachi. But a lot of them overlap. So it's not like when we talk about one, it's like, well, the other ones aren't working. Some of them are happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So
I think I'm still a little bit confused about like the end of Ezekiel talking about like the temple.
yeah.
And like how does that play at all like to this week? I know it doesn't like it's too big to actually fit in the Temple Mount, so it's not talking about the temple they're supposed to build, but yeah, I guess can you like speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, I could. However,
It's not relevant.
no, it's not relevant. It's just a complicated teaching, which because I do teach on that when I do those that week, but it's like a process to get there because it's apocalyptic literature, which is did you guys already cover that? I'm guessing at this point, yeah. So there's those things. If you understand the rules of how apocalyptic works, it kind of helps you, but apocalyptic is very difficult for us, especially those of us who are more modern Westerners, because it does not play by any of our modern rules. We like things to be like, oh, it shows the symbol, and we're like cracking a Da Vinci Code to get what it's talking about. And it's not really that way. So they'll give symbols and things, but actually the majority of it is not going to be a literal interpretation of event to event timeline. This is not how apocalyptic works. We'll talk about this with Zechariah because it does give us an example of it. But if you think of it this way, if you take the things, as you already seen, like this is a massive structure, right? So it's way too large to be a physical building, which if you go through the way Ezekiel describes it in the vision, there's 0 times it's mentioned that there's no command to build this. Right, so that would have been prominent because in every other time they've been asked to build a temple, they've been told, hey, you need to build this and it needs to look this way. There's no command to build it in Ezekiel's vision, nor is there all the dimensions given for someone to build it if they tried.
Right.
Because, if you're going to build something, you need 3 dimensions. It only ever gives you 2. So no one in the Old Testament would sit there and go, oh, he only gave us 2, we'll fill in the 3rd. You don't just roll with it to build the temple according to God's specifications if you don't know exactly how he wants it. So no ancient person would sit there and read that and go, oh, this is a temple we need to build in order to restore anything. What they are getting, though, is that, number one, it's already there when the vision starts. It's obviously built by God because there's no command for a human. So what does it mean that we're looking ahead toward a new temple not built by human hands, but by God himself, that the presence of God will return to? Can you imagine anything in the Bible coming up, maybe not this week, probably next week, that may point that, or even like these things, it's like there's water that's coming out from under the threshold and goes out, and that's for the healing of the nations.
Oh, right.
Like they call that rivers of living water.
Yeah.
Right? You ever pick up those in like John? Spots like that, it's flowing out of the heart of a person and the Holy Spirit.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah. So in essence, if you really, usually I'll take a whole morning to do that whole thing, but it is just, in my opinion, and it's not just my opinion, there's several scholars that would say the same. It's a apocalyptic vision of God going, this is what in the new covenant, when the Spirit comes, you and I are going to be that new temple. It's going to be greater than any building that's come before.
Wow, okay.
It's just talking about the coming Holy Spirit and a new covenant in people. Because that's where John goes, hey, out of your heart, when the Holy Spirit comes, out of your heart flows rivers of living water. That's for the healing of the nations. Like all these things. So that's how apocalyptic works. It's not an equal. It's talking about a building, therefore we're looking for a building. It's talking about this, but you're trying to figure out what is it actually communicating, and what are we looking for in that. And if you go to Ezekiel and go to the New Testament back and forth, there's the parallel language all through the Gospels trying to show you that image being completed. Okay, because now when we get to Ezra and they do rebuild the temple, you can tell that they did not at all look at Ezekiel's stuff, which does predate this, and use it as a template to build it. But that does show up, that particular, like, hey, how does this map into our modern day thinking, into a lot of, I'll call Kirk Cameron theology, our end times theology nowadays in the West, where we're like, oh, this must be a prophecy about the end of days and how this works. And it's like, that's an abuse of apocalyptic literature. It's not how it's.
That's why, like, a lot of people think, like, oh, like, we're not in end times because the temple hasn't been built in Jerusalem yet.
They would say, yeah, the temple needs, in that category, that specific people that has that theology, that temple needs to be rebuilt to usher in that end times, right? So, but again, it's not helpful in how the apocalyptic was meant to be used. And I'll show you, again, we're going to cover Zechariah. Zechariah is all apocalyptic. And once you start walking through it and you see how they use the symbols, it kind of demystifies it a little bit for us. All right. So it's usually like, oh, this seems very complicated. But once you get into it, you're like, oh, they actually give you the information you need to know. And the rest is more for like an experience. It's apocalyptic is also an emotional writing system. It's meant to show you not just what you should think, but how you should feel about it. And so that's why there's so much dramatic imagery. And they always pull from symbols from their past. And so if you know how the symbols were used originally, it tells you what you should be bringing into how they're using it presently. So that's as easy as I can make that extremely complicated teaching that we're not going to do this week. Because that is an Ezekiel teaching. All right, anything else? Anybody want to top that? Like anything more complicated than the Ezekiel temple that we want to hash out? That's a really good question. And that's why I do the teaching when I've done it, and we do it at BSN a lot, because I know people have that question. So I've just built out the whole thing. But what I do is I give each person the step-by-step process to find that. So we'll start with, all right, here's the sections of Ezekiel that talks about it. Write down what does it do to describe this temple. And then we'll start asking questions. And then we'll go, okay, let's look at Ezra. Do they seem like they have that reaction? And so we just, one by one, step through. Then we'll flip the New Testament and go, let's look at the mirrored language and put it together. So I showed them how to do it.
Good.
Okay, let's see. Oh, let's just put these up here. So this is just a snapshot, all right? These are just people to keep in mind. Some of them have no bearing whatsoever on what we're about to do. Like Cambyses and Pseudo-Samaritus, no relevance whatsoever, because they really don't do anything important. We really go from Cyrus down to Darius and then Xerxes, which Xerxes, his other name is like the Ahasuerus name that pops up, but that's in Esther. His name is Xerxes. I'm going to call him Xerxes this week because I don't want to say the other name over and over again. It's complicated and it's hard to say. So we're going to go with Xerxes, but that is his other name. His actual Ahasuerus is like the Hebrew, the Israelite name they give him, but his Persian name is Xerxes, which he's the more famous one, right? If you've watched the crazy movie like 300, like that's the Emperor Xerxes that's in that movie. So that's who Esther has to marry.
Wow.
He's not like some just normal dude. He was super creepy, like pretty evil guy that she married and had to be queen of. And then obviously after him, they're like, what do we call the next person? Artaxerxes. He's just like the next guy there. So these are the people that show up in this timeline, right? So these have already been in some of the stuff you've read, right? Cyrus is mentioned way back in Isaiah ahead of time, but this is where they kind of come out in the timeline. So keep that in mind. These are the general dates. Any dates you find in ancient history, there's going to be fluctuation. Okay, because it's not like the writing systems and the ways things were cataloged were exactly the way we do them today. So you'll find different scholars will put them in different spots. I don't think that's extremely important necessarily. It doesn't make or break the historical events or the interpretation, you'll just find different dates for stuff.
So is the second one, the Cambyses, is it the son of Cyrus or is it just somebody like from some?
He's just another guy that took over. Like Cyrus died, and therefore they had to appoint a new guy. And yeah, but he really didn't do him. And obviously, you see the next Pseudo-Smerdis, which lasts just that like a few months in that year. They're pretty unimportant until you hit Darius the Great. So there's a reason why there's the Great behind these two guys, because they actually pretty important. The other two are kind of like stop-offs, which you find in a lot of ancient empires. There's lots of kings that pretty unimportant, did things for themselves, and there's others that are remembered for, what they did. And those are two of them. I want to move forward, but I see everybody writing, so do you need to hang out here for a second?
Is this the same slideshow as last year?
Yes, except for I have added some things, which I do every year.
Yeah.
Because I can't be satisfied with what I do. I have to change it.
Well, that's good.
It just happens.
Well, never mind.
Well, yeah, generally, because actually this slide wasn't in there last year.
Yeah.
So this was a new one.
Will you
Added
send
some
us-
stuff to Esther.
Will you send us a
Yeah.
sister?
Yeah. If nothing else by the end of the week, because I will probably be adding stuff every day to it.
Okay.
So if nothing else by the end of the week, I'll definitely send that in to Bree and Karim, and then they can disperse it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Ezra. And I have it on here as Ezra and Nehemiah, because originally in the
Yeah.
Hebrew text, it was just one book. But we'll talk about the Ezra side first. And then there'll be a few of these other books in between because of the timeline. And then we'll get to Nehemiah. But obviously there is definite overlap between the two. So, all right, here we go. This helps me from not talking so much. So let's jump through some of these passages from Jeremiah and Ezekiel to get a little remembrance of here's setting the stage for Ezra and what we should be looking for in what he does from, this is pre-exile, because for you guys, before exile happened, what was the primary problem, if you had to boil it down, that the Israelites had, that God would had to deal with? Idolatry. So yeah, if nothing else, you can boil down their issue to idolatry. So therefore, the exile is trying to primarily address the fact that people's hearts were set on idolatry. So when they come back, you should also have the question, did it work? Did these people who return, are they actually going to respond faithfully to God and worship Him and Him alone? Or are we going to see the same issues as before? So that sets up most of these books. But let's just quickly run through some of these. We'll read these out loud together. Get on my... So starting in Jeremiah 13. Okay, let's start with you, Jesse, and then we'll just work our way across. You'll do the Jeremiah 13, 8 to 11. And obviously, you guys will do Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 11. I'll just do the 36 one.
Okay. Jeremiah 13, 8 to 11. Then I received this message from the Lord. This is what the Lord says. This shows how I'll draw away the pride of Judah and Jerusalem. These wicked people refuse to listen to me. They stubbornly follow their own desires and worship other gods. Therefore, they will become like a loincloth, good for nothing. As a loincloth clings to the man's waist, so I created Judah and Israel to cling to me, says the Lord. They were to obey. They were to be my people, my pride, my glory, and honor to my name. But they wouldn't listen to me.
Yeah. So think of it this way. Were the people of Israel at that time, when this is being spoken, were they doing the sacrifices in the temple?
Like
Okay, you're saying yes, Karim saying no.
like This time.
Yeah, during Jeremiah's time, were they giving sacrifices and all things? Well,
It's in this there in the exile. Jeremiah, right?
well, not at this time. These are earlier parts of Jeremiah, so they're still when they're still in the land, and God's telling them, "Hey, you guys got issues. We got to deal with those issues." Were they physically giving the sacrifices? Let's put it that way. We're not talking about, obviously he points out the heart here, but are there physical sacrifices going on in the temple? Everybody's like, I don't know how I should go with this. Overall, now obviously there's definitely things you can tell they're not doing whatsoever. They're not keeping the Passover. It hasn't happened for a long time, all that stuff. But generally, there is still sacrifices happening in different ways at the same time of them worshiping other gods in the temple at the same time. But there are indications from the prophet, especially Jeremiah, where he's saying, you guys are going to the temple and dropping your animals off, and you're raising your hands to worship Yahweh, but all he sees is the blood of the innocent on your hands. It's like someone, if they were here in our own country right now, murdered somebody, and the blood was still on them, and they showed up to Sunday morning service. And they're like, all right, let's get this party started. All right? I love you, Lord. But it's all red everywhere. That's the prophetic image that he's trying to get them to understand. Now, so there are aspects of the sacrifices being done, because even in other parts of the major prophets, he tells them, I want you to stop giving me your bulls and your rams. Stop doing the new moon, all of the stuff, because it's pointless. Now, let's map that back onto our understanding of the law, the Old Testament law. What does that mean about what the law and not the Passover, the animal sacrifices? If you just did them, was that sufficient? According to these passages. No, and why not?
Because God is asking, I don't know how to say this. God is asking to, not only the sacrifice, but obey. Like in Jeremiah,
Yes.
you see in the chapter 6, it says, I haven't asked the sacrifices when I sent you, and sister said, I'm asking you to obey and to be my people. That's what I asked.
Right. The reason I bring it up is because how many of us have heard teachings on the law where it's, this was just a system that they would do the sacrifices, therefore they get forgiveness, and then that was it. But the law wasn't really about the heart. It was just about how people tried to earn their way to God through doing the stuff.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. But what's the issue with that teaching when he sits there and says, just stop doing them? I would rather you, especially when you get to these parts of the prophets, do justice and mercy, walk in humility. You can't just do the sacrifices according to God and be okay. Because the sacrifices were never about earning anything, nor about how they wrought forgiveness and pulled that transactionally from God. Zero of that's in the Old Testament law system. But that is a prevalent way it gets talked about in modern Western circles. Why? Because we've latched onto one metaphor, which is law legal metaphors, and we've made the entire story about that. Here's the way the Old Testament law system worked. If you especially, let's say, take something, definitely not murder, because there was no sacrifice for murder. Capital offenses like that, you were done. Like it was actually a death penalty before you were off the bat. David is the one that bucks the system, because technically he commits several of them that have no sacrifice. He commits adultery with Bathsheba, and he commits murder through getting her husband killed in battle. And then when you get to Psalm 51, and he spells out, this is why, I know, God, that there is no sacrifice that you would take. All I can offer is a broken and contrite heart. And you see God actually forgive him. He doesn't justify what he's done, because there's still consequences to what he's done. But he does forgive him. Why? Because David gets that it's not a transactional system. I don't put in an animal and get out forgiveness. That's not how it's ever meant to function. So if we believe that about the Old Testament system, where it's transactional, we'll map that onto how we see Jesus coming up. Because we'll see that through the cross. So that's why you need to already start wrestling with that now. Because if it's not in the Old Testament system, if you committed some kind of issue, remember you guys already went through all the Levitical law and Deuteronomy and probably read the sometimes what can be mind-numbing lists of things of don't do these things, especially the whole chapters of like, don't sleep with all these animals. Don't sleep with your mother-in-law, all that kind of stuff, which, think of it like in modern day products. There's usually this little label on there. Especially for you ladies, it's like, hair dryer. It's like, don't use this in the shower. But why do you think they put that on there?
Because somebody did.
Because somebody used it in the shower. Why do you think God's telling them to don't do these things? It's not because they haven't done it. It's because they're doing it. And he's telling them to stop. So it's not like he's running through hypotheticals. But anyways, there are categories of like, okay, you've wronged your neighbor. Therefore, here is how you fix that, right? So then let's say it falls in the category of you need to take a goat to the temple and do the sacrifice. And you live in Jerusalem. We'll make it easy, right? Because if you live somewhere else, it's a pretty big journey to pull this off. But let's say you live in Jerusalem and you're sitting in your home and you look out, you see your neighbor Bob, and he comes out of his house and he's walking a goat and he's going the direction toward the temple. And you know the Levitical law because you grew up in it. What do you automatically know about Bob that day? Now, do you know what category of sin he would have committed based on the animal?
Kind of, yeah.
You would know at least ballpark what he committed based on what animal he's taken there. Because it would say, here's the list of these things, and then for that, there's a goat. For these, there's a bull. For these, there's turtle doves. It will tell you. So Bob is not only, again, he has to walk down the street to the middle of the city, which is where the temple is. How would you, now put yourself in Bob's shoes, okay? You've committed something wrong. Now you have to get the animal and walk past all of your neighbors to the temple.
Huh.
Talk about humility. Not humility, but walking and being humble.
Yeah, we call that public confession.
Wow.
And now you can choose not to do this, right? You can choose to hide it and just not do it. But the people who did it right, first step was public confession. You because you can't just hide. You're in a city and you're walking beside everybody you live around toward the place that you know is where you got to fix it. And they know what you did. So public confession is number one. Now, number two, you couldn't just drop your animal off and leave. That's not how it worked. You actually had to participate up to a certain point. Now, there's a point where when it gets to like the burning of the animal and things like that, the priest takes over. But at the start, you have to stand there and you come up to the priest and you go, this is what I did. He goes, okay, come over here. The altar is outside the temple, so you actually go with him to that aspect. And then you have to sit there and put your hands on the animal and confess what you did in front of the priest. But also, then he hands you the knife, and you have to slit the animal's throat and start the whole process. Now, how many of you did? Any of you grow up around like killing animals? Some. How does it?
Not me, but like we've seen like.
Right, around it somewhere. If you grow up around farming communities, like some people, you kind of got used to it around it. Now, you also couldn't just pick any animal. You had to pick a nice animal, like something that was worth something, which, had to be one of the best that you owned. Now, when you're a shepherd and things like that, you get to know your animals. They're part of your kind of general family, but it's also your business. So you have to give your best, which also means it costs you something because you just lost some of your income by giving up this one animal. And then if you're the one that has to take the knife and kill it because of what you did, what hopefully should be your heart response? Let's just say we rolled a goat in here today and you're like, all right, you've got to actually confess something that you did and you kill the animal and it's going to die because of what you did. What's happening in here? Hopefully. Repentance. That's it. It should have some kind of effect on your heart to go, I don't want to do this tomorrow. Right? And then now once the priest takes over, now you are free to kind of step back as the rest of the process goes. Because now he is your intercessor before God to do the rest for you. All this is a concrete step-by-step system to teach a people who came from a completely different background. What does it look like to publicly confess your sins, to see the cost of sin in your life, then also for you to realize the cost that you have created through your sin, and to repent publicly. And if you did it knowing your heart was involved, you could walk away with assurance that you were being forgiven. That's all it was. It was not a payment system to God to get him. You could not just throw an animal his direction and get forgiveness. Because obviously he says it here. If your heart was not in it, this was not a real thing. So before Jesus comes along, God built an entire system to teach people the categories of repentance, confession, forgiveness. And that's why it becomes obsolete later. It's not because, it was just based on animals. It was because now we have the life of Jesus to actually model those exact same things in a greater way than just this system did. Okay, so that's where we're at now, is people have been abusing this system for a long time. And the exile, as they're coming out of it, you've got to see what is the heart change in this. Is it actually going to be the heart, or are they just going to go back to relying on the systems? Are they just going to use it and say, this is what God said to do, as long as we do it, we're okay, but we can live however we want to? Because that's where they were beforehand. Okay, so this is the sequence that we got to get to. That's what these verses, Jeremiah 13, try to point out, because they are in the middle of this system, and God's pointing out their heart is the issue. It's not the fact of whether they're doing it or not, it's actually the heart and how it is not aligned with him. They're not actually repentant. They're not actually confessing their sin. They're saying that if I throw animals at God, that we'll be all right, that he won't destroy us because of that. All right, now I'm going to throw a lot of side tangents in there, but let's jump to the Jeremiah 31, and it's verses 31 to 34.
Yes. The day is coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and Judah. This covenant will not be like the one I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt. They broke that covenant, though I love them as a husband loves his wife, says the Lord. But this is the new covenant I will make with the people of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my instructions deep within them, and I will write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And they will not need to teach their neighbors, nor will they need to teach their relatives, saying, you should know the Lord. For everyone, from the least to the greatest, will know me already, says the Lord. And I will forgive their wickedness, and I will never again remember their sins.
So God's switching. It's not that the heart wasn't a part of it, but he's saying in this new covenant, the law is going to be written on people's hearts. It's not that the law goes away. It's just now that it's supposed to be internalized to the point where God himself will lead people into not just knowledge of him, but how to actually live this out.
Right.
Okay, Carly, let's go ahead to Ezekiel 11.
Then this message came to me from the Lord, Son of man, the people still left in Jerusalem are talking about you and your relatives and all the people of Israel who are in exile. They are saying, those people are far away from our Lord, so now he has given their land to us. Therefore, tell the exiles, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Although I have scattered you in the countries of the world, I will be a sanctuary to you during your time in exile. I, the sovereign Lord, will gather you back from the nations where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel once again. When the people return to their homeland, they will remove every trace of their vile images and detestable idols, and I will give them singleness of heart and put a new spirit within them. I will take away their stony, stubborn heart and give them a tender, responsive heart, so they will obey my decrees and regulations. Then they will truly be my people, and I will be their God. But as for those who long for vile images and detestable idols, I will repay them fully for their sins. I, the sovereign Lord, have spoken. Then the cherubim lifted their wings and rose into the air with their wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel hovered above them. Then the glory of the Lord went up from the city and stopped above the mountain to the east. Afterward, the Spirit of God carried me back again to Babylonia, to the people in exile there. And so ended the vision of my visit to Jerusalem. And I told the exiles everything the Lord had shown me.
Okay, so this is important because these are some of those repeated promises, but also back just to still remember where Ezekiel is now in Babylon, and his prophecies and ministry starts there, but there are still people left in Israel at that current time. So this vision kind of takes him back there of declaring these things, but also saying, all right, the Lord's Spirit is already, like his presence is lifted from the temple, and now not only is it left the temple, it's leaving the city of Jerusalem, and it says he heads east. All right, so if you remember that little map earlier, actually, here, I'll flip back to that map. So this map right here. So you obviously have Israel way over here on this side. And so you have, I'll just use some flames just to make it easy. God's presence, and it says he heads east. Where is he headed? What's far, far east of Israel?
Babylon.
Babylon. And why is he heading to Babylon? That's where his people are.
It's good. Wow.
So he goes in exile with them. He doesn't just send them off in time out, and he's like, in 70 years, I'll bring you back when I can deal with you. It's the presence of God lifted up, and it says he moves east, and he heads all the way that direction. As he's moving, he's going to where he's sending his people.
It's crazy too, because he goes before then. So he's like not asking his people to go somewhere that like he isn't already going.
Well, some of the people have gone there already, because there's already 2 waves of exiles have been taken.
Okay, that's true.
But he was still there because there was still hope that some people might be able to stay. If you read Jeremiah and stuff properly, he'll usually say, hey, if you guys would just do this, yes, Babylon will still come, but you can stay in this land. It wasn't a done deal that they had to all be removed. He kept saying it over and over again. Now, eventually they just kept rebelling, and eventually he's like, okay, I'm sorry, it's a done deal now. Like, you are all going to have to be removed. But when that comes is when he picks up shop and heads out. That's when it's the point of no return for them, the people who are left.
Interesting.
So he leaves with the people in exile.
Yeah, and also in this end of the book we see the vision for Ezekiel in the temple.
Yep.
And God's presence coming again.
Exactly.
And that is coming from the east.
From the east.
It mentions clearly that God goes to the east and he comes back from east.
Exactly.
So,
Yep. They come back full circle.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, so Ezekiel 36. So I'll read this out. It's 22 to 32. Okay, it says, therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations to which you came. And I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, and which you have profaned among them. And the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the Lord God, when through you I vindicate my holiness before their eyes. I'll take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land. I'll sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness. And from all your idols I will cleanse you. And I'll give you a new heart, and a new spirit I'll put within you. And I'll remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I'll put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. You shall dwell in the land that I give to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I'll be your God. And I'll deliver you from all your uncleanness. And I'll summon the grain and make it abundant, and lay no famine upon you. I'll make the fruit of the tree and the increase of the field abundant, that you may never again suffer the disgrace of famine among the nations. Then you'll remember your evil ways and your deeds that were not good, and you will loathe yourselves for your iniquities and your abominations. It's not for your sake that I will act, declares the Lord God. Let that be known to you. Be ashamed and confounded for your ways, O house of Israel. So why is God doing what he's doing through the exile also? Not just is he doing it for the people, but he's saying it's actually not on your behalf, but whose is it on that he's trying to make a message to in this passage? So he says he's exiling them, he's dealing with them, but he says it's not for your sake that I'm doing this, but for whose sake?
People around him.
Yeah.
Like them.
The nations around. Because here's where Israel also went wrong. Again, remember I was saying they banked on the fact that God would not let another nation come and conquer them, because that would communicate that the gods of Babylon are more powerful. That was their working idea from an ancient Near Eastern culture. And God absolutely says, no, I will, because right now, the way you guys are behaving and acting as a nation, you are communicating to the nations around you that I am okay with this. Like, you're communicating, this is the type of God we worship. The God who oppresses the poor. The God who is okay with murder and using that as a sacrifice to himself. All these behaviors. So he said there came a time where in order to vindicate my name among the nations, I have to say that what you're doing is not okay and I'm going to hold you accountable for it. And that is the exile. That draws a line in the sand to say, no, me and my people are not on the same page. And they are going to have to be accountable for how they've been called to live. So that's the justification for the whole thing. He's saying through this, he wants to rid them of idolatry, but he also wants to send a message to the nations of who he is. Because remember, he's not just out for Israel. He's out for the nations themselves from the start. Now, he's called this special people to be a part of that project. They're just not being very helpful at this current time. So he has to deal with them along with how he's dealing with the nations. Okay, do we need to take a quick break before we...
How are we doing?
Because this has been about another hour.
I would love to get that.
Yeah, let's do
Okay,
that. That way,
let's do 7 minutes, 11:45 to be back here.
okay, anyways. We're need to get started.
Yeah.
We're going to barely scratch the surface here of Ezra here in day 1.
Okay.
And then, but tomorrow it's just going to be, we're going to be cranking them through. Because we'll probably not just do Ezra, probably do some Haggai and Zechariah tomorrow. So once we pick up pace, like it'll just start going. Right? There's a lot of background info to get there. Meaning, like for the book of Ezra specifically, here's some of the background stuff. So most scholars would put it as, obviously it's attributed to Ezra, who's the most likely writer. We don't exactly know because it doesn't necessarily say it in the text. That's all it means when they say, not every time does it say when they're like, we don't know, and it's anonymous. It just means someone didn't specifically say, I wrote this. That doesn't mean we don't know who the writer was. Ezra is most likely not only wrote Ezra, but is probably the author of 1st, 2nd Chronicles because of the mirrored kind of language and the focus on the law itself. Because he is a scribe, which is what his background is. Mm-hmm. The theme of Ezra is how well are they going to keep the covenant? That's all he's focused on. So the way the stories are told and what stories get told are told because it's showing are they going to actually respond to what the covenant was and their response to the law itself. And that's a difference. So like, for example, 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st, 2nd Chronicles, you notice they both cover similar subject matter, but they were obviously written in two different time periods, so there's differences there. But for Kings, it's written primarily from a prophetic viewpoint. It's written on calling people to account of the law and the prophets' interactions with people as God is using them. Chronicles takes more of a scribe focus. It's going to go, we're going to chronicle the line of Judah primarily because they're writing from a later standpoint, but they're going to really focus in on the nitty-gritty aspects of the law and how people dealt with it. Right. So it's the same subject matter, but you can see it from a prophet's viewpoint versus a scribe law viewpoint. That's all we're talking about. So Ezra falls in that second category. He's very much like, how is this getting instituted? How are people being reestablished? And how are they responding to it as a new people? So there's a mixture of literary styles in here. So obviously you find narrative, but you also see that Ezra and the chronicler has access to letters, because thrown in here are letters from government officials from Persia back and forth to the local governors and things of the province. And so he just is like, oh, by the way, here's their letters. So he has access to them and he chronicles them so that you can see both what they're doing, but also how the people around them see it and how God's using this versus also how it seems like the enemy seems like using it to stop their progress. So, and we already said this. Originally, one book in the Hebrew Bible separated by the Greeks for their own purposes. Mm-hmm. So most of our modern Bibles resemble the Greek version of the Bible. This is why we have 1st and 2nd Kings. And the Hebrew Bible is just called Kings. Just one book. There was no first and second Samuel. It was just Samuel. The minor prophets were just a book. It was all 12 of them jammed into one thing, one after another. Ezra and Nehemiah was one book. So, but in the Greek version, they just separated them. I think it's more for convenience sake than anything. It doesn't change anything. It just is different format, really.
Gotcha.
And then this guy is super important. Cyrus. Right, so born in the late 500s. Most put around 590 or so is when he's born. And this guy is the one that really made Persia overthrow the Babylonians and create the initial main version of what the Persian Empire was. So he took over that entire known world and expanded their territory, which included the land of Israel, Judah in that. The one important thing of Cyrus and the Persians, which went along similar to the Babylonians, but very different than the Assyrians. So like when the Assyrians, back when they conquered northern Israel and the northern kingdom, their way of dealing with conquered peoples was to disperse you among the empire. So they wouldn't let similar groups of people stay together because they figured if we let this whole group just relocate to this spot and they're still together, we have problems because they'll probably rebel because they're all together. They can do stuff. So instead, they scatter people. So they will put, all right, we'll sprinkle some over here, put some over here, and then we move people of our own into their homes in their former country. Because the idea is, if you scatter people amongst the empire you have, within one generation, they'll marry some, random person down the street who's from a different country. And then when they have kids, they're neither ethnically the same as their parents. Now they're kind of a third culture. And they start seeing themselves as Assyrians, no longer as individual cultures. So the idea is to actually allow people to, through relationships and having kids, to kind of breed themselves out of their own culture. That's how the Assyrians worked. So this is why when you see the Northern Kingdom leave, you don't really see a lot of them ever come back because they end up merging with all the different people groups. And the Northern Kingdom becomes known as Samaria because you have all these other people groups put in there by Assyria, and they intermarry and just kind of over time morph into a new people group. And that starts kind of the animosity you pick up in the New Testament between Judah and the Samaritans. Because Judah sees themselves as, we were conquered by the Babylonians, but we kept our culture. We stayed as faithful as possible, and God brought us back into the land. You guys in the Northern Kingdom, you guys all compromised. You married everybody else, and now no longer are you Israel, you're Samaritan. So you're a second-class citizen compared to us. We're the people God really cared about in the end. So that started with that Israel, Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom, and how they were conquered. And then by the time you get to the New Testament, this has been playing out for several hundred years, and their animosity grows between each other. But it starts, my bad. It starts right here because this is why there's already tension between the people who do return. It came unplugged. I moved my computer. This is why there's tension between the people who are there, and then when the exiles return and they're like, hey, we're going to rebuild the temple. The people who are opposing them are now that Samaritan group. They're the mixture of the old kingdom of Israel and the new. So you already have this initial tension between them. They've already fully went the other way and are part of the Persians and are now opposing their own kind of former kin. Not all of them, obviously, this is where you're just like, all right, this person's right, 3/4 Persian, 1/4 Northern Israeli. Like, it's just a mixture now. So they're very clear, like, we're going to keep ourselves separate. As the people of Judah return, we don't want anything to do with these guys because they were left out of this for a long time.
Did the people of Judah, did they have kids with the people of...
You'll see that in these books. You'll see how that plays out in Ezra and Nehemiah. Because when they return, that's one of the initial issues they run into, and you'll see how they deal with it. Yeah.
So the Samaritans were a mixture of Israel and the Assyrians.
Yeah, and everybody the Assyrians conquered. Because, right, so every time the Assyrians would conquer somebody, they did this to everybody. They just mix everybody up. So they would uproot people from their homeland and sprinkle them and make them live in different parts of the empire, so where they're all separate from one another. And then, again, if you need to find a wife for your kid and all this, which, again, is very ancient Near Eastern culture, you only have so many options, and those are usually people who are not from your home country. So all it takes is one generation, really, and now you're going to see yourself more as, I'm a part of the Assyrian Empire. I'm no longer my individual cultural group anymore. That was how they did it, which really is these two ways, because the Babylonians and Persians didn't see things that way. They would usually allow people to stay in their home countries, if at all possible. Keep your culture, because they said if people can have some normalcy, they may be loyal to the empire. They'll pay their taxes, all this stuff. And as long as you don't cause problems, that's all it has to be. The problem with Judah was they caused problems and they got uprooted. Because they rebelled even after they got taken over. That's why they had 3 ways of exile.
Yeah.
So they are the ones that pushed the buttons and got it worse. But Babylon would have let them stay there as long as they just behaved themselves. That's basically all we're talking about. Now the Persians, same policy. They don't mind having whole groups of people from Judah live together. Again, same principle. Don't cause issues. You can worship your own God as long as you maybe throw in something for the Persian king every now and then. And you keep your culture, all that stuff. So think of it as like, obviously the Assyrians laid waste to the northern kingdom, but God made sure that whoever took over Judah preserved culture, preserved language, made it possible for them to stay as faithful as possible without land and without temple until the time came.
Yeah.
So this is more than just who took them over. It was also seemingly a work of God that how they were taken over was preserving a possibility for the covenant to be a future and for the line of David to stay intact and all these things that he had promised.
So in chapter 4 of Ezra, we see like the enemies, like it says like the enemies of Judah and Benjamin. So are they like part of Israel?
That's the possibility. I mean, because again, these are the people, those people who are opposing them are who eventually gets called the Samaritans. So they're a mixture of all different kinds. There's probably some who used to be from the northern kingdom that maybe but they all sprinkled in together. And now we're a generation or two past. So they're just a part of the province now. Okay. Let's start talking about Ezra. Because when you get into the book of Ezra, the first 6 chapters are really, Ezra's not in the picture yet. Like he shows up midway through the book, but he goes ahead and details for you all the stuff leading up to his arrival, which includes Zerubbabel and Joshua that comes in as the high priest and these things beforehand. So you get this kind of roller coaster from Ezra 1, which is Cyrus, like giving the decree, hey, let's send people back. Let's allow them to go back. We'll even allow them to rebuild their temple. Because again, their policy is, let's let people do it, because he's thinking, think of it from an ancient Near Eastern concept. If there needs to be prayer and favor on the king, let's do it from as many gods as possible. Let's make sure we cover all our bases. So they're not opposed to them rebuilding a temple as long as they remember to honor the king and those kind of things, which you see come up kind of in the Roman Empire, but it's a little shady. But you see this all the way, I mentioned this in this previous slide. These were those Isaiah 44 and 45, where he already mentions there's going to be this guy, Cyrus, who's going to be a part of releasing the people. This is God's working ahead of time. So when you get there and you get to Ezra, you're like, okay, yeah, Isaiah called this shot a long time ago. There's the guy. Like, God's using him to bring the people back. Because it even says from Cyrus in Ezra 1, God is the one who told me to send his people back to rebuild his house. So, again, think of it this way. God's doing, the focus of the Old Testament, especially throughout the Bible, is mainly on the people God chose, which started with Abraham and now turned into the people of Israel. It's not the only people he's working with. Right? There's tons of people around the world he's working with. Now, he chose them for a specific role to play in this story. But they're not the only special people in the world. Hopefully you've seen that through random people that pop up in the storyline. They've never had any interactions with Israel, whatever, like a Melchizedek. People like that. And it's like, oh, he's not only king, but he's a high priest of Yahweh. Completely different. Okay, so God's working all around the world at the same time.
Right.
The storyline, though, is telling us a specific story of how he's working with this people group to be priests in the world to help bring redemption to it. But he didn't call them out to be like, you are the saved people, and everybody else is just going to have to wait their turn. That's also not in the Old Testament narrative. There's lots of people who are faithful to Yahweh, but he calls Israel out and says, hey, I'm calling a person, which is Abraham, and your descendants are going to help me in this redemption process. But you've got to also play your part. There's a way you're called to live.
Well, there's lots of other nations that are faithful to Yahweh.
Or lots of other people in other nations.
Oh.
And again, we don't know the nature of Cyrus in his totality. We just know somehow he's hearing from God and he's willing to do it. But Melchizedek is the prime example. He's never been an Israelite. He wasn't from the line of Abraham whatsoever. But it makes it super clear in the 4 verses he shows up in that he is not just a king, but he's a high priest of God himself in the city nation of Salem. Okay, so this predates any of Israel or anything. Now, Israel has these little prefixes they put on things for Yahweh. So if you just go much later in Salem's history, eventually we have a different name for this place. And they just attach that to it. And we call it that. Because Jeru or Jeho are both different prefixes in the Hebrew language that put a Yahweh spin to it. That's all they are. So prior to David and any of the Israelites coming around and conquering this place and taking it for Israel, it was Salem. But there was already a faithful king and priest that lived there prior to anything materializing that Abraham interacts with. Wow. That even blesses Abraham. So again, just think of it as God did not just work with just these people. That was the prime storyline of redemption, but he is faithful to reach and be with people everywhere at all times. We understand that now. We just got to map that back onto the Bible. And remember, he's not limited in how he does these things. Okay.
Wow. That's interesting. I think I struggle with that a lot. It's you focus on a specific people group, but then I was always like, what about the other nations? He was still making himself known at that time, to other nations, so they still had a chance to really know Yahweh.
Exactly. Wow. And again, this is not the focus of the Bible, because it's trying to tell a specific story of what is God like? How is he interacting with people? What does it mean for him to bring redemption? And it shows it in a people he chose to fulfill that vocation. Because, just because someone was Israelite did not mean they were faithful to Yahweh. Right? We see plenty of those. So this is not a term of Israelites are the saved ones and everybody else is not. Because you can definitely tell not everybody in Israel fits that bill. Mm-hmm. So he's called them, though, to be priests. That's really their vocation in the Old Testament. Which priests were just the people that mediated, showed the world who was God, and represented people to God. They were the mediators between the two. They were representatives of both. And so that was their job. Israel was supposed to, through how they lived as a nation, communicate to the world, this is who Yahweh is, the true God. And when they failed that vocation, God had to deal with them in a way that was equal to the calling that they were given. But just because they're exiled also didn't mean they were now unsaved. So I'm trying to untangle some unhelpful categories from how we see the Old Testament. It's not as clear cut as saved, unsaved as it comes to Israel. There's saved, unsaved people in this whole mix, but they were all, if they're part of this people group, called a part of the covenant to fulfill a role. And that same language gets mapped in the New Testament for every New Testament, New Covenant believer. That's why they use the term priesthood of all believers. You are now those living sacrifices, ambassadors for God. So it's just that it started with a people, and now it's to all who follow Yahweh through Jesus. It's the same storyline.
Interesting.
Okay, so
Can you, sorry, the verse reference and from Isaiah. What was that again?
Oh yeah. There you go.
Thank you.
Okay, so see Cyrus does what we've been expecting through Isaiah. Says, hey, everybody, whoever wants to go back can go back. Now, one thing you see is that not everybody who was from the old kingdom returns. So by the time you get through the genealogies and the things where Ezra lists off the returned exiles, there's eventually, it comes out to 42,000-ish people that come back. That's definitely not all the people who left. So remember, even through the prophets, God's been like, I will bring a remnant back. This is that remnant. That means a portion of the people that are willing to return. Because after people have spent 70 plus years in another country, they've built homes, they've had lives, not everybody is willing to pick up shop and go back. So God's realistic with that. He goes, I will bring back those who are willing to come back. Now the book of Esther talks about how is God dealing, or how is he taking care of all the people who didn't go back? Because that's the Jews everywhere else. So at the same time as there's already been people returning, Esther is the story of, well, what about the Jews everywhere else that never returned? This is the story of how God's still interacting with them everywhere else. Okay, so we'll get there, but that's an aspect of how you see the story. As they're going along, right, this is like the prehistory part of Ezra. He goes in details like not only do people go back, Zerubbabel being one of those from the line of David, but they start rebuilding the altar and the temple, which again is why they were sent back. But they don't get very far in what happens to them. They start rebuilding. And they finish it, no problem.
They haven't read it yet.
Yeah, we have.
Oh, you're ready? I'm sorry, guys.
I was just like, I should let you know. You asked questions and I'm
What
like
have you read so
responding.
far? You read Esther, not Ezra. You read Ezra today?
Ezra today.
Okay, well then we'll see when we get done. Yeah, I should look at that reading list because you sent me that. No, you sent it to me. That's my fault for not double checking it.
So during this time when they do come back, they still don't have a king or anything.
Correct.
They're just now a people back in their homeland.
Yeah, but like destroyed homeland. Because right, the Babylonians killed, like they destroyed the walls, they destroyed the buildings, they destroyed the temple. So they're returning to a burned out, broken down city. So as they return, they don't have homes, they don't have anything.
They just start all over.
They have to rebuild all the stuff.
And the king of Babylon is essentially still the king that they're under.
Well, this time it would be Persia.
Or Persia.
But yes,
It's
they're
still the king that they're under. They just don't have their own independent king.
Yes.
But they are not absent of a ruler.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess just like the men of the family would lead and be like, okay, we're gonna build our house here. We're gonna do
Yeah,
this.
I mean, it doesn't give us a detailed description. Like, they go back, and obviously they've got to figure out where to live. But their main goal as they go back is to rebuild the temple and the altar.
Mm-hmm.
Because to them, so like to us, we have all these different categories, right? We can live wherever, we can go to church wherever. None of that's super high important. Like, we get to pick and choose. To an ancient people group, especially the Israelites, there's 0 point in having houses and land if you don't have a temple to actually properly interact with the God who protects you and who oversees your life and all those things. So that's why it's utmost importance to get that built. Because without it, like, this is why they went into exile in the first place. They treated it as if they didn't have a God. And that's what it resulted in. So in order to reestablish, you need to reestablish a place where God himself is there with you. And so that's where they come back. But yeah, it doesn't give us, like, more likely, yeah, they're going to have to differentiate, like, who's going to rebuild whose house. And like, all right, Bob's got that house down the street, and this person gets that. And they have to actually, like, tent city it until they can get their homes rebuilt for a while. But they also don't have walls around this to protect them, which is super important in the ancient cultures. Because that means you're subject to anybody who comes by and is like, oh, we could rob those people. That's no problem. And if there's no walls to keep people out, that's always a threat. So all those aspects were important, which is where Ezra and then through Nehemiah, it's this whole process. Like, how do we rebuild everything? And also reestablish the priesthood, reestablish how we interact with God and the law in the midst of these people who've come back. And what do we do about the people who live across the river who want us to do all their kind of stuff? And the problems that come, the messiness that comes with that.
Okay. So are the people following the law at this point, like before they come back? Like while they're still in captivity, are they like still? I know we talked about Daniel and like, but yeah, where are the people at?
Yeah. So yeah, Daniel gives you that glimpse, but just think of it like this: the only way you could properly do the law is with the temple, because you can't do sacrifices just wherever you want. You have to do it a certain way. But they had abused it so poorly that when they go into exile, it's the first time really that God's trying to get across to them, hey, now you have to figure out how to live faithfully to me without all those things. Because you don't have your land anymore. You don't have your temple. You don't even have your culture anymore as the dominant culture. You now have to figure out how to live faithful in Babylon, in a place that is going to pull you every direction to be unfaithful through unclean foods, through the practices, through pressure to worship the Babylonian gods. And this is why it might be that a remnant comes back, because not everybody made it clean through that process. Not everybody knows. And this is, really, Daniel's a great test case for like a modern day scenario. Like, how do we live faithfully in this culture? Because our culture more resembles a Babylon than it ever does in Israel. Like, as much as we would really love for America to be called a Christian nation and all this stuff, we do have obviously amazing positive things came from a Judeo-Christian worldview, but we are a Babylon. It's who we are. And there's too many churches that just look like a Christian Babylon. And so this is where the lesson comes in. Like, how do you live faithfully in a culture that makes you want to worship everything else? And if they can't get you to worship everything else, it'll get you to worship yourself. Whether it's through your comfort, your luxury lifestyle, your security, whatever else. It'll fill in the blank for you if you're not intentional. And so these guys have already these are the ones that it seems like have kept some semblance of faithfulness, that enough that they're willing to pick up and go back and rebuild, because they know when they go back, there's nothing really waiting for them. They're going to have to work to get this done. And then they're going to have to reestablish how the law works, because they can't do that till the temple gets built. And Ezra is a big player in how that gets reestablished. So Daniel's the only kind of maybe good narrative snapshot that we have of what it looked like. So it doesn't really give us many details other than that. But these are indicated like these are the people that kind of came out on the other end that God could restart with. And even when you read through the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll find out they're definitely not perfect. They still got some stuff, but they're going to try to deal with it as they come along and hopefully respond differently than what they did before. Even if it's not always the right way. Because there's also some, how do we deal with things? And it's like, oh, I see some Pharisees coming out in this. Because I'll leave that for you in your reading. Because hopefully you'll look at it and go, oh, I see they did a problem. I'm not quite comfortable with how they fixed it. So that they could do a good job of pendulum swinging from one extreme to the other. And they keep missing God right in the middle here with how you live it. And they keep going to like apathy to just like Pharisaism, like extreme religious rules of how to follow it. Okay, let's see. We got 20-something minutes. So they get started on the temple, and almost immediately they get hit with the people around them who was already in the province are like, wait a minute, what are you guys doing? Like, why are you here? Who gave you permission to do this stuff? And so immediately, think of it, it's already hard enough. They did pick up from their family living somewhere else for 7+ decades to come to a place that they're going to have to camp out and rebuild a city. But then think of doing that and trying to keep a good mindset. And then all these people around you are like threatening what you're trying to do. Like it's opposition right off the bat. Now, the way the narrative works, you guys will, sometimes when you read this, you don't quite pick this up because you're just in the mode of reading and you don't quite think through all the details. It happens to all of us. But you'll notice there's this little thing in here where in chapter 4, first 5 verses, it's like, oh, hey, we hit some opposition. Here's the guys around and how they don't like what we're doing. But And so they write a letter of accusation saying to, and in this one it's mentioned as Xerxes, to his reign of like, hey, did you give them permission to do this? Okay. But then once you start verse 7 to 23, it's mentioning a letter to Artaxerxes. It's a completely different person. Remember, I showed you that list at the beginning. Those are different kings. Yeah.
We see that, like, in this chapter 4, we see they receive a reply from Artaxerxes, not from the Xerxes.
Yeah.
So, like, wait a minute.
Yeah. All right. So this is not a common thing we like to do today and with our way we record history, but this is a thing in the narrative. They call this a prolepsis. Okay. So this is a literary tool that you would say, hey, we're encountering issues, but oh, by the way, here's even a glimpse into our future. This is going to be a recurring problem. So they're writing a letter accusing us now and going to oppose it, but this is also going to happen later on. And we're going to go ahead and preview that. So they skip timeline. They go, here's our problem right now, but let me go ahead and give you a preview. This is a problem that's going to happen again later in Artaxerxes' time. So let's go ahead and include that. And then by the time it gets to the end in 424, it jumps back into the present and goes, yeah, see, you got the same problem. We've got continual opposition that's happening over several decades to the temple being rebuilt, on and on. So this whole chapter is kind of cut up between their present circumstance, jumps to the future, then jumps back into their present circumstance. And all they're trying to do is think of it like in the Old Testament narratives, there's usually these literary themes. So sometimes they record things according to a literary theme. It's not necessarily the best chronological way to tell it, which is how our modern way of doing things is. They'll introduce a literary theme, which is opposition. They'll go ahead and show you where this plays out in other aspects of the narrative in the future while wrapping up that literary theme and going, this is our continual problem.
So they're writing this because, like, they like to do Artaxerxes to like say that, like, this is going to happen in the reign of, like, Artaxerxes, so to the Xerxes.
Well, it happens multiple times. So he goes ahead and mentions it's happening right now, but oh, by the way, it's going to happen again in the future, and here's that letter also, which is the Artaxerxes one, because he's a later emperor than Xerxes. So he just goes ahead and mentions it's happening in Xerxes' time, it's going to happen in Artaxerxes as well, and this is our problem that we're going to face for the next few decades. So it's an ancient Near Eastern way to go ahead and introduce opposition, not just right now, but the theme that they're going to face throughout their time there. I know. It's not an easy way of how we do stuff.
But they receive reply from Artaxerxes.
Yeah. And that's the future aspect, right? So that, like, it goes back and forth.
So they haven't, it's like...
Yeah. Now, when you read it tonight, try to look for it. Okay? So try to use this template so that way you can follow it along, and hopefully it'll make sense. Because I know it's a little hard because you guys haven't gone through all this just yet. But take this template in and read it, and if you still have confusion tomorrow, we'll most likely start back in this spot to keep going through Ezra so we can hash it out a little bit more. But I don't want to get too far into it with not everybody being able to read through the book just yet.
So in verse 24, it's back to present, but starting in 7 to 23, it goes back.
Yep.
Okay.
It's all future stuff. It jumps ahead and then comes back.
So this letter is written in the present, like during the reign of Xerxes.
There's one letter written during Xerxes' time, but then there's another letter written later to Artaxerxes.
So this is to Artaxerxes period they wrote it, and they're writing again.
Yes. That's what he's trying to say, is that this isn't just a one-time problem. We have this problem multiple times. Because remember, Ezra is covering stuff in these first 6 chapters that happened before him. So he's going and covering it all by saying, problem here, next we're still going to have a problem later, and then later on I show up, and this is how the narrative keeps going from 6 and on. So he's covering all the history beforehand, but they like to do this sometimes with a timeline.
the letter, like the letter to Xerxes isn't mentioned here. Like what the essence of it, what was that in it.
Yeah, so verse 6 is where they say, in the reign of, and it's Ahasuerus, which is Xerxes. In the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants. That's the mentioning the letter there. But then in 7, they go, oh, and by the way, in the time of Artaxerxes, they also write a letter and send it to him too.
Okay.
And so that's where it jumps ahead. And then 7 to 23 is all about how this future interaction also happens with Artaxerxes. He also is going to be a part of it, of opposition. So it's a long little detour until you get back to 24, and they're like, so hey, jumping back to the present, the work of God stopped on the temple. That was the end result of it, even in that present time, until the reign of Darius, which is comes up in the middle of those guys.
Okay. And how long was the period between the first letter and the second letter?
It would have been, let's see.
Where does it say?
So, sorry. This is the other confusing part. There are multiple Dariuses also. I didn't include the second one because he's not always mentioned. So it's sometimes some scholars get on the detours here of which one it is. So in here they mention like, hey, there's a problem here. It comes up and we'll get a reply from Darius. So again, let me circle back to this tomorrow so I can help untangle this a little bit more on it. But it's a kind of like, again, it's a very confusing way Old Testament narrative throws out multiple timelines as if this is just normal, which for them it mainly is. This is not how we do things at all. We're like, we need the sequence. Yeah, Jeremiah too. Nothing's in order whatsoever. Yeah.
I also was just going to say, they also think different than how we're even taught to think in culture now. Like this linear thinking style is so different.
Yeah, they value putting similar events together. Even if they don't chronologically happen at the same time, they value like, oh, this event and this event literally fit together because they're the same stuff. If you're uncomfortable now, just wait till you get to the Gospels. Okay? This is why we have different Gospels that have different events. It's not because they're trying to give you a chronological play-by-play. It's because sometimes they group things Jesus did in literary categories together. And they actually happen in completely different parts of his life.
Mm-hmm. So
but they don't care. They completely do history different than us. Mm-hmm. Okay? So again, just be ready to be uncomfortable with the Bible and how they record things. Because they're not modern people. Right. And so they have a vastly different way of doing it. Okay, so let's see. What should we adequately do? Okay, so eventually, and this is kind of an overview, we're going to dive a little bit more into the details of Ezra tomorrow. Eventually, you do get this thing of like, they do start rebuilding the temple. Because again, they realize, we've been neglecting what we were supposed to do. And some of that comes about because of the prophetic ministries of Haggai and Zechariah. So when we get to them, it'll kind of be jumping back into this specific part of the timeline to see how were their messages getting the people to go, hey, you guys abandoned the whole project of why you're here. And you detoured. So we got to get back on track. Otherwise, this is not how the return to the land was supposed to go. Okay, so that's also in here at the same time. Okay, so eventually you get this letter to Darius and his response where they're like, hey, because this is later people, and they're like, are these guys supposed to be doing this? Which tells you it's not the first people that asked. These are completely new people around them. And when the building starts again, and so then they're like, can you check to see if anybody gave them permission? And this is where he backtracks and goes, actually Cyrus did give them permission and said for us to pay for it. So let them do what they're doing and actually give them the stuff they need to do it. So you finally get some good traction on them getting the temple back going until in 6, they actually finish and dedicate the temple in the new land. which is super important because they actually have a temple to work with now.
Wow.
All right, but just, I know you guys haven't read it, but let's go to this little section, 6:13-18, because there's some important details in here you don't want to miss based on our whole temple discussion. Okay, so Ezra 6:13-18. You getting voluntold? Does anybody want to read it?
I would love to.
Okay. 6:13-18.
Tatanai, governor of the province west of the Euphrates River, and Shethar-bozenai and their colleagues complied at once with the command of King Darius. So the Jewish elders continued their work, and they were greatly encouraged by the preaching of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo. The temple was finally finished, as had been commanded by the God of Israel and decreed by Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, the kings of Persia. The temple was completed on March 12th during the 6th year of King Darius' reign. You said until when? 18?
18.
Okay. The temple of God was then dedicated with great joy by the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the people who had returned from exile. During the dedication ceremony for the temple of God, 100 young bulls, 200 rams, and 400 male lambs were sacrificed, and 12 male goats were presented as a sin offering for the 12 tribes of Israel. Then the priests and Levites were divided into their various divisions to serve at the temple of God in Jerusalem, as prescribed in the book of Moses.
Okay, so after several hundred years of depressing Old Testament stories, how does this one strike you? By the time you get here, yeah, it feels like we're finally getting somewhere good, right? Because even when you get back into the King's timeline, and you got like Josiah, and Josiah was a bright spot as far as a king. But if you notice the little details of how everything was described, like they were giving the sacrifices, the Passover, but every time it was used in Kings, it kept saying Josiah was the one that provided everything for all the stuff. The people did not, they showed up because the king told them to show up, but it did not say the people were coming and giving offerings. It said Josiah did. And then Josiah commanded everybody to do the Passover. Commanding someone to do the Passover is different than them willingly wanting to do the Passover. So again, he was doing all that he could from a governmental standpoint, but you see from how Jeremiah was describing it as the people were not in this with him. They were doing it because they're commanded to, but there was nothing else. Here is the first time you're like, no, there is no king compelling them to do so. The temple got dedicated and they start actually reinstituting the dedication process. The priests are put back into a service. Like things are starting to get back to what they were meant to be doing. So there is positive momentum, finally, for the first time in hundreds of years, as people back. And again, this is still a pretty shattered city. So they're doing this in the middle of still pretty burned out homes. There's still not a wall around the city because that doesn't come about until Nehemiah comes around, which is much later. But hopefully you start to feel a little bit better about the people who've returned after exile. Because even after this, they celebrate for the first time in believe me, till the earlier King's period, the Passover. So right after the story, 19-22 just details how the people actually celebrate the Passover together.
Wow.
Which the last time that's actually mentioned to be celebrated well, outside of Josiah's commands, was early on, probably in Solomon's time. Maybe a king after him did it, but it's not really highlighted anywhere. So it's been a very long time. And the Passover was like the defining moment of them as a people. Right? That was like how their identity was formed. People that were in slavery who are now free in a new kingdom with Yahweh. See how that works? There's a whole thematic thing. This is why also when Jesus comes around, he dies on the Passover. Like, slave free, we're slaves, free, new kingdom with God, all the stuff, right? So that's it. That's how defining it was. So the fact that they had neglected it for so long was a huge, huge problem. That shows you how far their heart was out of this. Because it was like, the only reason why you exist as a nation is because of this event. Outside of that, you were still slaves in Egypt. So the Passover was literally how God had rescued them out of that and established them. So this here is showing, I think Ezra is trying to point out, like, look, there is actual faithfulness growing in this people. It's definitely not complete, but as they're participating and willingly doing so, you're seeing them kind of grow back into the people God called them to be a long, long time ago.
Why do you think that is? Like, they didn't have like a king that was telling them to do it. Why do you think they did this on their own? Is it because of God left the remnant of people that were like after his heart, or?
I think there's an aspect of that, right? These are the people who seem like they're in this, right? But then there is also like, hey, they learned their lesson from the exile. And then you do have these influences from like Zerubbabel and some of these guys who are leading the people and going, hey, we're getting back to the law. Like we neglected that before, and we don't ever want to do that again. Because the last time they neglected the law, they lost their land and everything. And now that they're back, like you see them take this stance of, we'll do whatever possible to not fail Yahweh again according to the law.
Right.
Because that was what got them in trouble. Now again, that's the very roots of what several hundred years later becomes the Pharisees. And the Pharisees get a bad rap, but let's let them off the hook a little bit. Because the entire nation, remember, neglected the law, and therefore they were kicked out of the land by God himself for what they did. The Pharisees form because they want to make sure they never make that mistake again.
Right. Yeah.
That's really all it is. They just take it to such an extreme that it creates a different problem. It creates a problem of where the worship is not directed to God, it's worship of the law itself and of their status and the things that come along with that. But the roots of it were not necessarily wrong in themselves. They just wanted people to honor God in the fullest, the way the law called them to. So they never had to go through an exile again. So again, this is all the roots. And I'm prefacing that because we'll talk a lot about that through the intertestamental by the end of the week, of how this stuff kind of snowballs and those different groups that pop up. All right, I don't really have enough time for us to really bring out anything else, but this would be a great time if there's any questions, thoughts, things that you want to know before we wrap up for the first morning. I know we've barely scratched the surface on that, so.
Can you remind me who Zerubbabel is, what his role is? Like,
yeah, he as he returns, he's from the line of David, so that's one of the important literary things they want you to know. But he returns basically as like the governor over the people. He's kind of has a leadership governmental role, and he predates Ezra. But he's, again, because Ezra's covering history before he physically arrives. This is where it's super important for Zerubbabel. But Zerubbabel's in both Haggai and Zechariah. So we'll also get some detours there about him, about Joshua, who is the new kind of high priest that comes with Zerubbabel into the land, things like that. Just skipping on up there. It's good. Any other questions? Anything that we've covered so far? I asked that one time while leading a youth mission trip, like, are there any questions? And a kid raised his hand and he's like, can you tell me why it is that women like flowers? And I was like, okay, I should be more specific. Is there any questions about this current lesson that we're talking about?
That's a very like in the chapter 2, maybe you might touch it tomorrow or not. But so in chapter 2, the end of it, it says like once all the people they came together, and it says like the rest of the people returned to their own towns to Israel. Like it's like kind of for me, like is it like they went to Samaria and all of stuff?
No, because now, so think of it as, for a long time, there was the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom.
Yeah.
And basically, from this point on, this doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But what they do is the writers start switching out. And instead of just, from now on, we're calling them just Judah, they just start, the Israel name now encompasses all these people who are left.
Okay.
So it becomes an interchangeable name for anybody who existed from, it's mainly Judah. But you do see people from like Benjamin, from Levi, from others sprinkled in. So they just, so for a long time there, you had to be specific, like is it Judah or is it Israel?
Yeah.
Now post-exile, they're just going to start using the term Israel for anybody who's left.
Right.
Like anybody who returned to the land, they're Israel again. Which is kind of, some of the prophetic messages tell you that. God says through Ezekiel that he's no longer going to have an Israel and a Judah. Like he's just going to call them one people again. So it kind of plays into that. So, yeah. But even historically, they're just like, those are Israel, or we're just going to call them Jews because they're from Judah. So they resettle, not just like, Jerusalem would be about right here.
Yeah.
They also resettle all the other towns that most of them are
Not
from.
the northern part.
Not the northern part, because that's a completely different land now. That's Samaria now.
So no one's living here at the time because it's just such a wasteland. No one wants to live there.
No one lives especially in Jerusalem, but it doesn't mean there weren't people sprinkled through that would have just came in and just settled in land. But there's not any built cities because it's all been leveled. Most of the population lives up here. So that's when they usually talk about the Samaritans or these other people who are like the people around them.
Yeah.
They're usually up here, but there are some sprinkled around.
So they wouldn't have to go and like reconquer people.
No. It's just kind of like, those people are kind of living out, mostly in a deserted, burned out area. Because it's been sitting there for a long time. But, again, by this point, more than 70 years, because exile was generally 70 years, and now we're getting past when people have arrived. All right. Well, let's call it for the morning then, or it's not morning anymore. It's almost 12:40.
That's so quick.
Thanks for listening to the YWAM Nashville Podcast. If you want to get more information about our community, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Spotify, YouTube, and TikTok at YWAM Nashville. To get connected, visit our website at ywamnashville.org or contact us at info@ywamnashville.org. Adios.